So this is going to be a video about the Badab War and its timeline, the main event of the Badab War and the succession and all that with Huron Blackheart. That all takes place in 901 M41 right through to 913 M31. So over a decade this happens, and it's generally a very drawn out, bureaucratic and then sort of protracted warfare that occurs over these years, which I think really speaks to the scale of 40k, right? This is like a relatively self-contained conflict, but it's still, even after it's got going and the first blood has been drawn, it takes 13 years to resolve.
It's a good example of, again, that administration, that bloat in the system where it takes so long for anything to respond and build momentum. That 13 years can just be seen as this interscene sort of conflict between rival factions. In any other context, it would be, a colossal scale of a conflict.
Yeah, and I think it speaks again to that colossal scale, the real history of the Maelstrom, which is this kind of warp rift, the second biggest in the galaxy, only behind the Eye of Terror, where this conflict takes place. The first real records of it that we have in the Warhammer history books is M31, right back in the Great Crusade, so 10,000 years before it all kicks off, where during the Great Crusade, the attempts to pacify the Maelstrom were and all the pirates and renegades and the like that lived in there, that fails. The Emperor declares pacification to be too costly, and attempts to deal with the Maelstrom, even back in the sort of halcyon great days of the Great Crusade, fail.
Do you think that might also be because of the secrets he was looking to keep in regards to the warp?
It's a really good point. It might be, but I think the fact that they went in and started trying to pacify it, and then we're like, no, maybe not. That doesn't so much speak to me as trying to keep these secrets as, just, oh geez, this is a bit too much right now. We've got other things to deal with. Let's just lock it up and try to ignore it.
Yeah, we'll circle back to this problem later, once I've finished conquering the rest of the galaxy. I'm sure nothing will go wrong between now and then.
Now, come on, Horace, let's get on with this war together. Following this, M31, during the Scouring, this is when the traitors, the Horus Heresies happened. Can't believe it. Gilliman sort of declares that the outer worlds of the Maelstrom should be fortified and reinforced just to contain it. Rather than trying to pacify it, he's more like just trying to put a lid on it.
Arguably, this is the start of what you might know in the sort of modern context of things like the Cadian Gate and all those gate worlds where they were sort of fortified and sort of defended against excursions that obviously during the time of the Scouring they didn't expect it to coming back out, but more of a way of blocking them in.
But unlike the Cadian Gate, one thing the Maelstrom does is spit out things from other parts of the galaxy. Sort of entire planets can just sort of drift lazily out of the Maelstrom and go into orbit around others, which obviously meant that you end up with this great wealth in the area, right? There's all these minerals and things to be mined and operations to be had, which meant all sorts of parties through M38 through to M31, sort of 3,000 years leading up to the current timeline of the setting. This area really grows in importance, and there ends up being all these guilds, Adeptus Mechanicus, noble houses, all of these interested parties that kind of want to get a piece of the Maelstrom.
To give ourselves a real life example, it's the fertilest land is usually the land near volcanoes, isn't it? It's that maelstrom and that volatility that gives you the reward, the risk versus the reward in relation to it. I suppose this is no different.
The volcano erupts pretty violently, so this is right into M41 now, into the kind of the sandbox setting of 40k before the era Indomitus, but still very, very recent in history. In 557, Signax, which was like a key world in terms of fortifying and defending the Maelstrom, it falls to a local death cult sort of propped up by a word bearer's sort of force. They get hold of the planet's nuclear arsenal and completely destroy the world. They actually cracking its crust and destroying the entire planet, which is a massive blow to the Sexter's stability and defense.
I would imagine that would, given the strategic value of that location in M41, where we know that the warp punches back, as it were, that would be a severe crippling on the forces that are dedicated to that area to defend it against would-be invaders.
Yeah, indeed. And it's such a bad blow to the sector that only a year later, the Maelstrom Warders are founded. Now, this is a super important event for the whole area. These are 4 whole chapters of Space Marines that get assigned just to defend this area and kind of contain the threat of the Maelstrom. Kind of shows how much work Signax was doing if they felt like 4 chapters were needed to replace it.
Yeah, exactly. And like you say, they wanted to defend that sweet loot.
Yeah, exactly. Imperium, we've got to keep the tithe flowing. That's a constant theme throughout this entire thing of the Imperial tithe. If you want to explain a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, the Imperium is essentially a futuristic, despotic feudal system. And so the planets that are part of the Imperium are required and expected to pay an annual or a regular tithe to the administration that is the Imperium. Often that will be in the form of planetary defense forces. It will be resources, munitions. So obviously in that environment you have a lot of these planets specializing into specific manufactoria or into specific kind of roles. This is where you get things like the Forge Worlds that just produce, en masse weapons for the Imperial Guard. Or you even get things like these Death Worlds that produce these highly specialized platoons of troops that can go out then into the rest of the galaxy and fight and defend other worlds and other parts of the Imperium from its foes. And that's what this is in many ways, that this tithe is the powder keg, if you like, that sets a lot of the later sort of conflict and violence into action.
And this is kind of the way that it goes then. The Maelstrom Warders, they get set up, they start sort of securing the area, making sure the tide's flowing. And these are 4 chapters of Space Marines. They'll come up again and again. The Astral Claws, the Mantis Warriors, the Lamenters, and the Charnel Guard. They were kind of, it's a good mix of different chapters there, right? You've got some White Scar successors, Ultramarine successors, Blood Angels, all these kind of different aspects of the Space Marines, like working together to protect this area. This goes pretty well. They kind of, I think they get themselves set up, taking over, like setting up fortress monasteries, generally kind of stabilizing themselves. And by 640 to like 651, there's a thing called the Scourge campaign. This is where all 4 of the warders kind of get together and they nearly pacify the region. They go on a massive offensive campaign and knock out a lot of the pirate bases and different Xenos creatures in the area, even defeating the death cult that destroyed Signax, which is a great boost for the region to get rid of that kind of past terror. But then the Charnel Guard are called away to a different war zone by the High Lords of Terror, taking a quarter of the Warders' forces away and forcing them onto the defensive.
I think this, more than anything, is what makes this particular sort of series of conflicts most interesting, is that you can see from the initial Scourge campaign that the Wardens were proactive about the Maelstrom. They essentially wanted to get out there and kick some ass, take some names and, pacify the area. Something that obviously earlier on the Emperor alluded to being too costly an enterprise, but clearly the economics of the situation are different in M41 versus during the Great Crusade. And they obviously, maybe there's an argument as to whether this was what the High Lords wanted, what the Imperium wanted them to do. It may have been a question of resources, but for whatever reason, the Imperium chose to continually sort of deny them that crucial sort of manpower and resources at a moment when they might otherwise, achieve a good success, a worthy goal, and they keep getting stymied throughout the process.
Yeah, it's that Space Marine mentality, I think. They kind of always want to be on the attack. They're not a defensive force. They're not guards who stand around. There's something that has to go out there and kill. Speaking of that, though, I suppose this was a kind of a bad time for the Warders following this. The petition to have a replacement for the Charnel Guard, it never happens. And then a kind of inciting incident about 60 years after the Scourge campaign ends. The Astral Claws chapter master, he's killed. He chases orcs into the Maelstrom out of frustration, I think is sort of stated as why he ends up breaking with his usual tactics. And he's killed by the orc war boss. And a humble figure, Huron Blackheart, although I'm not sure he's called Blackheart this time, but Huron is elected as his successor by his chapter.
That, more than anything, is probably the bit that will propel this area, wrongly or rightly, into conflict with itself. The crucial changing of the leader of those Astral Claws, and the loyalties and the pacts and the blood oaths sworn amongst the Maelstrom Warders will be the foundation by which everything essentially kicks off.
Indeed. Speaking of sort of things start to kick off, in 718, so a few years later, there's a big civil war on Badab Primus. Now this is kind of the most important planet in the region after Signax was destroyed, and the nobility, there's a kind of a failed coup, there's civil strife on the planet, and Huron decides, rather than, he kind of says, well, I'm not going to let another Signax happen, he intervenes, he executes the nobility of the planet and more or less takes over and styles himself as the Tyrant of Badab. That's a title he does give himself while he's still ostensibly a loyalist, but I don't think in the Imperium being called Tyrant is that bad of a thing, really.
When you are...
Thank you all very much for watching the video. This wouldn't be possible without the brilliant help from those at Stellar Play Hosting. You can host all your favourite games at a reasonable price. Visit stellarplay.online to find out more. Right, now let's get on with the video.
Essentially space Nazis, the good guys. I would suggest that being a tyrant is probably akin to just being, the Lord Regent.
And he sets about doing all sorts of regent stuff. He establishes the Tyrant's Legion, where essentially it's pretty unheard of and a pretty big step that people, I think, don't put as much emphasis on. He essentially draws all the local planetary defence forces, all the local fleets assigned to this region of space, and he puts them all under his own personal command and the command of the Astral Claws and the other warders. And as well as that, reinforces all this fleet available to him with captured vessels from heretics and other pirates, and generally kind of massively, this boosts, the region's defensive capabilities quite considerably. The Tyrant's Legion are very effective and stabilises the region.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the implication from the lore is that Huron does this because he's denied resources from Terra, despite the fact that they keep petitioning for help because they need the support. And it's because the Tyrant's Legion is also, they have Space Marines embedded in the actual army, don't they, as well, if I'm not mistaken, which is that's very much a different standard of combat to where most of the Imperial forces sort of run. It's the exception to the rule, I think. So it's interesting they chose to do that. But as you say, he just goes on a bit of a looting spree, nicking everything that isn't nailed down, stealing traitor ships and using them in his own fleet. No manner of resources spared his grab for what he might call, sort of security and further sort of developing the intent of those wardens to defend the area.
Yeah, and it's like, I think it's straight up not allowed in Imperial kind of law. They're not, you're not supposed to be commanding Imperial Guard or Planetary Defence Forces as a Space Marine. But there's all sorts of legal loopholes and bureaucracy. And after a big petition for reinforcements that gets denied, this situation actually, this is something I found interesting looking at the timeline. The time where he establishes the Tyrant's Legion and starts taking over all these ships, a good 130 years pass. You get right up to 860 before anything else really happens, of Huron just essentially being like the king or the tyrant of this region of space.
Yeah, as you said, the Imperium doesn't do anything quickly, does it? So yeah, it's no surprise at all that all this is allowed to go on, probably while the message is sat on someone's desk, spoiling for decades at a time.
And I guess all that matters is the tithe continues to get delivered.
That's it, yeah, spice must flow.
Well, 869, quite a bit later then, after the tyrant has sort of fully taken over the region, the Maelstrom Warders, they ally with the Black Templar Crusade fleet, and they go on the offensive. It's noted that about 23 Xenos and heretic strongholds are destroyed or taken over by the combined forces of the Warders, the Tyrant's Legion, and the Black Templars. They all kind of work together. And this is the closest the Maelstrom ever comes to being pacified. Where sort of imagine Huron thinks he's on the very cusp of completing his goal and proving that the Astral Claws are worthy of, being the leader of the Warders. And then, well, the Tyranids show up. So the Black Templars are called away.
I mean, that would sting, wouldn't it? It's interesting that even with all that work that's done, the intent is still there to pacify the region, even without necessarily the help of Terra. And once again, something else sort of conspires to snub the efforts of the Wardens in sort of essentially performing their duty.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the kind of Space Marine mindset. They can get a little tunneled in on something, and Huron, this is the thing that really sort of breaks Huron. People sort of speculated that this is when he begins to fall to whispers coming out of the Maelstrom, maybe just to his own pride and arrogance. I guess he doesn't see the big picture, right? The Tyrannic War is a big deal. It's not like the Templars weren't called away for any reason. You've got to give the bureaucracy its due there. But yeah, this is really the time where it starts to go off the rails in terms of his loyalty to the Imperium as a whole.
Yeah. There's some interesting stories that you can sort of find throughout some of the content with the lore, where you have these would-be Space Marine chapters that are seemingly on the verge of turning. They're not yet traitor, they're not been declared traitorous, but they are sending people all the wrong signals. And I think you're right. By this point, the nihilism and the anger and frustration that would have been with the Astral Claws was probably such that they'd be like, what is the point of you lot?
Yeah, especially considering that, they were seeing this success until right now.
Absolutely.
And this kind of leads to, there's about 25 years where Huron just starts withholding the tithe from the Maelstrom. He always keeps all the resources from stealth, starts building up his own forces and using those resources to defend the Maelstrom. And this causes a real scuffle. The local lords, I believe the Carthans they're called, they sort of panic. They need that tithe to meet their own tithe quotas, and they attempt to take the tithe by force. They sort of send a relatively well escorted fleet in and attempt to sort of bully worlds without letting Huron know into giving them the tithe. However, in 901, the Warders just straight up attack this tithe fleet. So this is the first real Imperium on Imperium violence, and the tithe fleet is it's baseline, planetary defense force troops against Space Marines. Doesn't go very well for those PDF soldiers, and all their ships are either destroyed or, as is the style of the Warders.
So thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, everyone. I'm going to be making a few more narrative videos like this, and I hope to see you all again soon.